Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our Power of Being Data-Driven webinar. It's part of our 2024 Not-for-Profit Speaker Series. So during the session today, we're going to help you understand the power behind using data as a decision support tool to enhance your decision-making processes. My name is Anthony Pember, and I'm a Managing Director in Cherry Beckett's Strategy and Transformation Practice, and I've spent a career helping clients with cost and performance management. And as such, I've spent a lot of time helping clients understand their data, how to cleanse it, normalize it, visualize it, and most importantly, use it to support decision-making. I've done this for a wide range of clients, commercial clients, government clients, higher education institutions, and also not-for-profit organizations. Joined today by Hina Kanwal, who's going to be our other speaker. So Hina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Anthony, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hina Kanwal. I'm a manager in Cherry Beckett's Strategy and Transformation Practice. I have several years of experience working in data analytics, data visualization, data modeling across several industries, including the federal government, the not-for-profit sector, and also higher education. And within each of these areas, I've also worked with a number of organizations with varying size, varying complexity, and by nature, varying challenges. So I've learned a lot personally through my experience, and I'm looking forward to share a little bit of that with you today.
Thanks, Hina. So just before we start, let's go over a couple of the learning objectives. So today we're going to go over some of the fundamentals of data analytics and how it can be used. Then we're also going to discuss some of the common challenges that organizations face and the strategies that they use in leveraging their data for decision making. And then finally, we'll also take you through some use cases that highlight how organizations have used their data to drive some impactful decisions. But before we start, let's have our first polling question. And this is designed to help us understand your experience with data analytics. So what best describes the current state of your organization's data analytics strategy? Is it no central organization of analytics tools or techniques? General guidelines have been established for individuals to develop analytics on their own. You have a formal, detailed strategy that you follow, or you've gone so far as to establish a center of excellence that coordinates all your data analytics and tools. So if you could just answer that question, single choice, what we're looking for is to get a sense of who's in the audience and what experiences you've had in relation to analytics and the use of it in making decisions. And don't forget, you also need to participate in 3 of the 4 polls to make sure that you get eligibility for CPE. All right, so let's see what we've got. So if I'm looking at the responses here, about just under half of you say that you don't really have any central organization of analytics, or you've got some general guidelines that individuals follow, but very few of you actually have a formal strategy or have gone so far as to establish a center of excellence. So hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll be a little bit further down the road of being able to move towards that more detailed strategy and center of excellence, or even at the very least have some good suggestions on how to use the data you do have to help guide decisions. All right, so let's get moving on this. So this slide here is actually interesting. It's a line from a poem by Samuel Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And it says, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Basically, it's a poem about a sailor that was becalmed at sea, and the mariner's surrounded by all this water, yet none of it's drinkable because it's all salty. So I would say if Coleridge were to write his poem today, he could easily call it The Rime of the Data Scientist. And the line may go something like, data, data everywhere, and not a bite to analyze. Most organizations have a lot of data, they're drowning in it, but often they don't know how to use it, or it's siloed in all sorts of different systems that don't talk well to each other, and it requires a vast amount of cleaning perhaps to make it useful. And so even if they do have the data, organizations often don't have the capability to clean, transform, and leverage the data to help provide insights and make decisions. But things are changing. There's all sorts of tools, things like Alteryx, Tableau, Power BI, and artificial intelligence that's making it easier and easier to sort of navigate your data, leverage your data, and help it drive decisions within your firm or organization. All right, next slide. Okay, so there's no denying that there's been an explosion of data, and there appears to be, in my opinion, no end in sight to the explosion of data. So let's just look at the top right-hand side of this screen here, a day in the life of data. Every day, and this is every day, the world creates about 333 billion, with a B, emails, and 24 billion text messages. Now, that number of 24 billion actually seems a bit low to me. When I see how much my kids are texting and how much my kids are texting my wife and myself and their friends, I swear they create the 24 billion texts themselves. But 24 billion texts, there are about 8.5 billion Google searches each day, and that doesn't include searches on other search engines like Bing and elsewhere. There's about 1.44 billion hours of video that's streamed in things like Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, things like that. 500 million tweets are created approximately every single day. And this is the one that really floored me. 150 million hours in Zoom meetings per day. And now I swear all 150 million hours are just my meetings, but I'm sure you all feel that way, but that's a lot of Zoom hours in meetings. So all of this is interesting. And what's even more interesting is that, there are about 5.35 billion users worldwide that are creating and consuming this data. And the creation and consumption of all this data, consumes somewhere between 2 to 5% of global energy consumption worldwide. And it creates approximately 4 million tons of CO2 emissions each year. Each day. I keep thinking it's a year because the numbers are so big. That's each day. So all of that equates to about 403 million terabytes of data that we're creating each day. In 2024, we created about 147 zettabytes of data, and in 2025, we're expecting that it'll create about 181 zettabytes of data. So that's a 74-fold increase since 2010. It's a huge amount of data. It's escalating. If you look at that chart on the left-hand side, it's going to keep escalating in sort of an exponential curve. I expect it to be huge in years to come. So I mentioned this term called zettabyte. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not. What is a zettabyte? It's a lot. It's a 1 followed by 21 zeros. So there's a lot of bytes in a zettabyte. I can't comprehend that size of number. So I searched around and actually found a way to help quantify it. For those of you that like movies, 1 zettabyte is the amount of data storage that's needed to hold about 10 billion, that's billion with a B, 4K movies. Now, if you were to watch those movies end to end, it's going to take you about 1.8 million years to watch. So that's a lot of movies and that's a lot of space. And we're creating hundreds of zettabytes a year. At the end of the day, we create a lot of data. Like I said, a lot of organizations are drowning in data. We have data around us all day, every day. Next slide, please, Hannah. So what about that? We have lots of data. It impacts everything we do in both our personal and our professional lives. Data is the key to uncovering insights and patterns. It's useful in making informed decisions, both in the workplace, but also at home. Imagine going to the supermarket and not having the prices on the shelves, or those little handy sort of unit price numbers. I don't know if you've ever seen them in tiny little font underneath the price that allows you to compare one product to the next in terms of a unit cost. How would you, if you're searching for a generic item, how would you know which item to choose? Most people will, or a lot of people will shop based on price. If there's no price on the supermarket shelf, how would you do that? How could you shop to a budget? And that's just a very simple example of how data is being used every day by us. It's so critical that it's considered by many organizations as a strategic asset. Companies that can leverage, or organizations that can leverage data effectively, are the ones that are going to succeed in a data-driven world. I would argue that this has probably always been the case. People have been using data from the early days, but in our digital world, it's just escalated to a point where if you're not strategically thinking about your data and how you can use it to drive decisions, it could potentially be putting you at a disadvantage. So some examples of where data is used commonly in the workplace: measurement of performance. both internally and externally. We manage our people. We look at performance measures and metrics, but we also do that externally by looking at donors, looking at services that we're delivering to stakeholders. We also use it to support customer service. For those of you that have customer service, I certainly call customer service on a regular basis with organizations I interact with. Having intel on your customers, their buying patterns, sentiment analysis. Some of you may not have heard of this, but they will often have systems that will read keywords in messages that are sent to customer service, or even listen to phone calls and identify keywords that will indicate to the customer service officer, is this person neutral, angry, frustrated, happy? And that helps the customer service agent actually deal with the person that they're interacting with. And even as simple as just information on what you've bought, what you've provided, what you've done with the organization, so the customer service rep has context to the conversation. And then everything we do, we collect and leverage data in pretty much all of our processes and operations day to day. Sometimes it's deliberate, capturing information for the purposes of feeding analytics. In other cases, it's just capturing it because there's a digital system that's associated with what we're doing, and it just captures information. And often we don't use it, and we probably should. And that's part of the basis for today's session that we're talking about. Next slide, please. Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about data analytics maturity. It's really helpful when discussing an organization's ability to be more data-driven by thinking through where you sit in a spectrum of different analytics capabilities. Many of you have maybe seen a chart that looks like this. Basic takeaway of this slide and this chart on the left-hand side is that as complexity and your maturity increases in your data analytics capabilities, the value to your organization and your ability to make more informed decisions, data-driven decisions, will actually increase. And the way to read this chart is if you start at the bottom left, you've got your foundational analytics. Typically ad hoc is what's considered foundational. These are things like one-off analyses, typically done in silos, that are designed to address a single question of some sort. Often it's a single individual who's doing the analysis, and usually it takes a lot of time sourcing, cleaning data, pulling it together, concatenating it, which leaves a lot less time to actually do the analysis to address the question. And then the next level up is descriptive analytics. And so that's, it's an extension of ad hoc, but it's probably, generally being done more deliberately and more consistently. And it's a look into the past and describes what's happening historically by leveraging past data. It's very helpful in supporting operational reporting and will usually provide some sort of lagging business insight. So, for example, you could be looking at budget to actual comparisons historically. You don't realize that you've gone past budget until you've gone past it. So that's a lagging indicator. It would be really good to be able to start to do predictive analytics at some point, to be able to say, does it look like we're going to blow past our budget? And that comes a little bit later on. Next is diagnostic analytics, and that's all about taking historical data and examining it, and usually through things like statistical analysis, regression analysis, help to understand the cause and effect of things happening in the business. So you may take, for example, financial data out of your financial system and combine it with customer data of some sort to see how and why the spend that the money that you're spending is impacting the outcome for the end user of your products and services. So rather than just looking at historical data, you're actually now linking it to other things and trying to determine a cause and effect. It's a necessary step. This sort of diagnostic capability is a necessary step to enable predictive analytics. So predictive analytics is about using statistical models and machine learning to help forecast future trends. And it's extremely useful and can allow you to sort of take that historical data and test future scenarios and consider possible outcomes of a change in the way in which you're doing business, perhaps. And this sort of analytics allows you to really create leading indicators to support your decision making. So going back to that budget versus actuals, predictive model, very simple one, would start to say, based on historical spend in, over multiple years, at certain times of the year, you're spending more, and it will look at what you're doing so far this year and predict where you're going to be in 3, 6, 12 months' time. And then, of course, we get to the holy grail of data analytics, or at least to people like me, who's a big data nerd. My kids always look at me and say they don't understand why I enjoy analytics so much, but I do. But that's the getting to the prescriptive and the cognitive analytics. So in prescriptive analytics, you're not only looking at future trends, but you're going a little bit further and providing recommendations and actions. So the systems that are built and doing these analytics are looking at the information and starting to sort of indicate what is it that you want to do to achieve a certain outcome. So one thing I'd say here is that when you get into this prescriptive and even the cognitive that I'll talk about next, is no analytics is infallible. At least not yet. Maybe we'll get there one day, but right now they're not infallible. So you want to always add some sort of human consideration to any of the recommendations that you're getting from an analytics platform. And the same goes for cognitive, right? You get to the cognitive, which is really the realm of artificial intelligence. And this is where systems are learning and intuiting things based on the data that's available to them. And as the data gets more, they learn more and they intuit more, and they can provide more insightful recommendations based on what it's learning and intuiting from the data that it's seeing and processing. But again, you need to be careful to make sure that what you're getting from a system that's cognitive or prescriptive, it's sense checked, and that there isn't some error in there. Particularly, right now with AI, for example, there's a million examples of where AI is producing content that is wrong because it hasn't learned enough yet. So you need to be aware of that and just cognizant of that fact. So, I mean, the question to ask here is, where are you on this maturity model? What do you want or need to be in terms of levels? If you're at ad hoc, where do you want to get to? Do you want to get to predictive? Do you want to get to cognitive? When you're having this sort of thought to yourself, also remember that not every organization needs to get to cognitive. It may not be worth the investment. It may not be something that you need to effectively run your business. So just because there's levels of maturity doesn't mean you necessarily have to achieve those, certainly in the short term, but maybe not even in the long term. So I'm now going to hand over to Hina, who's going to take us through, some of the concepts of why would you even want to be data driven. Hina?
Thanks, Anthony. So that really is the key question here. Why does all of this matter? Why should we be data driven? And this is something that we'll continue to pull a thread on throughout this session, but at a high level, being data driven promotes transparency, supports decision making, and enables optimization and reporting abilities. So the first one here, transparency. Leveraging organizational data, whether it's your financial data, your operational data, your transactional data, or any type of data, really boosts trust within an organization. So when decision makers and leaders are making defensible assumptions that are grounded in data, they're using fact and they're using logic, making it easier to not only trace a decision point down to its source, but then also be able to explain and justify that particular choice. And this really goes hand in hand with supporting decision-making capabilities and the fact that decisions based in data are generally perceived as more objective, again, since we're applying logical reasoning rather than relying on anecdotal evidence or the intuition of a certain group of decision makers at a given point in time. And with the use of data, not only are we boosting this accountability, transparency, and trust across the organization, we're also optimizing operations by making these evidence-based decisions. So whether that's through resource optimization, process improvement, cost savings, or revenue enhancement, the ultimate goal really is to optimize your overall efficiency of the organization and continuously be improving and evolving, and data is a great way to do that. And then finally here we have reporting. So relying on standardized information also enhances your reporting capabilities because you're able to leverage a consistent approach that can be replicated and that can eventually be automated. Because again, if in a given year, a decision is made upon the general intuition of a group of people at a point in time, it's very unlikely that we'd be able to repeat that exact approach a year from now. But if we're pulling data from organizational databases and systems of record and developing a process for decision making that can be documented and that can be referenced again, that's something that we can actually repeat and automate on a regular basis going forward. And not only that, if we do have a repeatable and an automated process, this is something that you'd be able to generate probably more often and probably at a much lower level of effort. Let's say you were only able to do a certain type of analysis that was pretty crucial for you once a year because of the time that it took. If you were to create an analytical process, whether it's through a workflow or a model or a dashboard, based on data that exists within your organization, that's something that you could probably start repeating quarterly, monthly, and then maybe even get to real-time analysis with automation. So there really are tons of benefits associated with becoming more data-driven.
Yeah, just one thing that I would add there, Hannah, and you sort of touched on it with the decisions are more objective and less subjective. Generally, decisions that are data-driven are perceived to be fairer. The people who are receiving that decision will generally look at it and say, yes, that it was made in a more objective way, therefore it's fairer.
That's a great point. Thank you, Anthony. Okay, moving on, just some key considerations. So as organizations evolve and work towards becoming more data oriented, there are several key points to consider when embarking on this sort of data centric journey. The first one being strategy and vision. So there has to be an overarching strategy and vision that is understood by the majority and can become sort of a collective goal for the organization. So we first need to start by identifying what that strategic vision is, but then also be able to document and communicate that vision. As part of this, we want to ensure we have answers to questions like, what do we need? Where are we starting? How are we planning to get to where we want to be? And creating and documenting a roadmap allows us to answer some of those questions and communicate that vision to, again, all pertinent stakeholders and not just a handful of decision makers. This also really helps when it comes to culture and change management. If you have people on board from the very beginning, there will naturally be less pushback. And again, not saying that there won't be any pushback, but you're able to mitigate some of that by being transparent and communicative upfront. The other side of this, and something I'll mention, is in some situations, perhaps it's just not feasible to be completely open from the onset. And that's a balance that needs to be figured out and sort of top of mind in these situations. It's really important to know who should be involved, how they should be involved, and how that overall message should be communicated. So after understanding what the vision and goal should be, it comes down to what data and access do we actually need to accomplish this? And with that, it's not only understanding what data we need and where it resides at a database or system level, but how clean and usable is that data? Do we now need to develop an ETL functionality to pull and cleanse and stage the data, or is it already in a usable format for us? If that's the case and we need to develop an ETL functionality, who should be involved in that process and what personnel should have access? These are all really key questions that need to be answered when moving towards a data analytics approach. And then once we do have our internal data systems and a strong understanding of what data we need from them, we then have to think about what technology is going to be necessary. So depending again on how complex the data is and how much work has to be done to potentially clean it, there will likely be a need to explore some options for applications and tools to support the actual data processing component. And then also figuring out how that fits into the larger systems architecture. One example I'll share is that for certain areas within the federal government, any software that we use must be on-prem because there are very stringent requirements around data security in the federal government and where their data is stored and what systems are speaking to it. But For other organizations that we've worked with, a web-based software is entirely and perfectly fine. So it really comes down to what your individual needs and requirements are. And then the final piece here is overall management of data and governance capabilities. So data stewardship is very critical in ensuring that roles and responsibilities are assigned and understood. Not only that, policies and procedures need to be established for this, and not only established, but also documented and regularly referenced. Data quality management is also highly important because one thing to really remember here is your insights are only going to be good as the data that you use to generate them. So ensuring that the data you're using is accurate, complete, reliable, and secure will be very key. All right, moving on here to the components of an analytic center of excellence. So a COE is essentially a specialized organizational unit that centralizes your expertise, your best practices, and your resources. And the purpose of this is really to ensure an effective use of analytics across the entire organization. So this is not something that everyone would necessarily need to create, but if the goal is to do large scale analytics, this is something that should definitely be considered. Otherwise, what might start to happen is that you would have pockets of people doing different things without an overall sort of cohesive strategy. So looking at the diagram here, the three colors represent different tracks or work streams that each play a very important role in a center of excellence. So the first one is just the one in orange here is agile development, and that's really referring to getting your data out there. The agile piece comes in because you want to be able to test and adjust solutions quickly. You want to be able to respond to change or any issues that come up. You want to be able to take corrective action when needed with regards to the data being used. But again, there's no good in having this data deployed if no one knows what to do with it or no one knows how to leverage it. And that's where the analytical proficiency comes in. So we can get the data out there, we can build really flashy reporting dashboards, but what typically can happen is people don't know how to use the information. And whether that's because they don't know how to use the specific tool or application, or they don't understand the data itself, or they don't understand the assumptions that were made for the analysis. So again, analysis is really great, but it won't get you too far without educating people on the approach used, the lessons learned, the best practices, and then just how to generally understand and apply the data. The last line here is user community, because it's not just about educating people, but it's also about creating a larger community where one, change management challenges can be addressed, but two, also create an opportunity for your users to engage with each other. And this can be through different things like office hours or newsletters or internal trainings and webinars. It really just comes down to the level of support you'd want to provide and would be necessary given the initiative you're undertaking. And this is something that we commonly do for our higher education clients after building analytical models. We'll go in, we'll build a model and then develop tons of dashboards to show the results of what we've done. But along with that, we'll also offer a few weeks of training to go along with it, to talk through the data, to talk through the assumptions that we made, and then also how to interpret what's being presented, because you really want to make sure that data is being properly understood before it's being used to then make decisions. Anthony, anything else you want to add here?
No, the only thing I'd add here is you made the point earlier, just to reinforce it, that a center of excellence is something that not everyone necessarily needs. But if you're doing any significant analytics and you want to create a sort of program across the organization, then a center of excellence is something that you might want to think about. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to have full-time people working in it, but it should have the elements that you see on the screen here to really enhance the capability across the organization, whether that be in producing the analytics, in sourcing and cleansing the data, all the way through to end users being able to leverage the analytics to help support decision making.
All right. So when moving towards becoming a more data-driven organization, there can be a number of challenges that arise and need to be worked through. So a very common challenge is around technology selection and understanding which tool would best suit both current and potentially your future needs, because it's not just about where we are at this point in time, but potentially where we'd like to eventually end up. So we can start by evaluating what tools we already have and what might be worth acquiring. Making sure that there's clarity on how to deploy a certain tool, how long that deployment would take, how to ensure that it's secure, are often questions that come up in this process. Another point here is making sure that you have the right resources who do understand any of the necessary tools required for any given implementation or initiative. Another common challenge is just generally determining a path forward. And this can be due to the inability of accessing data, or the fact that the data sits in multiple disparate sources that are difficult to link to one another, or that data definition is lacking. So again, this ties back to that key consideration slide where we discuss the importance of firstly coming up with the strategic vision, then understanding where the data is, how to access it, how to ensure it's reliable, and then how to get the right people involved to push forward. And then, as with any organizational change, resistance is somewhat expected. It can be difficult to get everyone trusting a new approach or a new process, especially those that have been leveraging legacy approaches for some time. So again, this is where change management plays a really key role. Being transparent and promoting open communication ensures that folks are on board each step of the way, rather than waiting until the very end. Can go a long way. Typically, when we're engaged by clients to develop an analytical modeling process, there's almost always a steering committee or a focused project team that's established to help with a number of things, but especially the change management function. And then lastly, funding and staffing is usually an issue that can typically come up because budgets can be tight, or there might not be the right internal resources to perform the work. So there has to be some type of balance or trade-off when considering the implementation of new analytical processes. All right, this brings us to our second polling question of the day. So in my organization, leaders and team members can access dashboards and reports with real-time data needed to aid in making decisions. We have A, true. B, we have some dashboards and reports, but not in real time. C, we need to have a technical resource develop this information each time we need it. And then D, we don't have the analytics currently in place.
So just a reminder to make sure you answer at least 3 of the 4 questions. You want to make sure you do that in order to get your CPE. Yeah, I would say it's interesting. Hina and I, we do a lot of work with a lot of clients, and we see a wide variety of organizations. Some that have all the way up for a lot of dashboarding capability and analytics, all the way through to ones that really just don't know where to begin. Okay, results. All right, so a good mix. Some of you said true. Most of you said that you have some dashboards, but the data is not real time. And then a few of you said that you didn't really have any analytics to make decisions, but a majority of you have some element of analytics, which is good to see.
All right, moving on here. So in this next section, we'll cover a series of use cases to really drive home the benefit of employing data-driven strategies in your organization. All of these use cases are based on real situations, but the facts have been altered to anonymize and protect the identity of the organizations involved. So starting with the first one here. This first use case focuses on a 4-year higher education institution. This particular institution was aware that some of their programs were more expensive than others, but they didn't have the data to quantify and understand the extent of this issue. So really the question here was understanding if there was a business case for this institution to be charging differential tuition to its students, depending on what programs those students were pursuing and how much each of those programs were costing. So before leveraging any data to answer this question, they were unable to quantify the differences in the cost to teach different programs, making it pretty much close to impossible to convince leadership that any type of differential tuition was needed. In addition to that, there was also a general perception that charging differential tuition was generally wrong, which again, without any factual data, was very hard to change this narrative. So what we did was we ended up being able to calculate the cost per credit hour by program. And with that information, the institution was able to identify large unit cost differences between their programs. So for example, being able to know that nursing cost X amount and it was substantially, costed more to teach than English, as an example. And this is something that, they probably already knew and had their intuition on, but providing the data actually helped them to then justify the implementation of differential tuition. Beyond that, even the institution was able to leverage this cost data that we calculated to develop different options for charging differential tuition, but then also combine that information with expected enrollment trends to then help revenue projections. So the benefits, kind of kept coming as they started out with this analytical journey. So again, the outcome here really was being able to have the ability to convince decision makers to consider and implement a new approach because the data truly supported it. The second use case here focuses on a large nonprofit, which was known to have significant overhead expenses and really needed to review its administrative functions to understand if any changes could be made to help them operate a bit more efficiently. So here the bottom line question was understanding how much the organization's administrative areas impact their costs of delivery. So before incorporating any data, the nonprofit understood it had some administrative bloat, but it was unable to demonstrate the extent to which its admin areas impacted their delivery, and then also how much they contributed to the total cost per individual served. So after taking on an analytical approach, and after using data, they were able to calculate the total cost per individual served and break out that information by administrative contribution. So the nonprofit could clearly show the administrative impact on its cost to serve. With this, they were able to use data during periodic reviews to monitor their efficiency and then just continually assess the drivers of their admin costs. So the entire initiative worked to reduce the nonprofit's administrative burden, again, solely through this data-driven approach.
Yeah, just before we move to the next page, Hannah, this is actually an interesting one because this approach that they used by looking at the contribution to the total cost per individual served was the first time that the administrative functions got a sense of what their burden was on the eventual output of the organization. And so from that perspective, it provided a level of I don't know, buy-in from the administrative areas to really sense that, oh, this is how much they're impacting that cost to serve. And as a result, we're able to feel more connected to the mission of the organization, which was a really interesting offshoot of this analysis. It was something that they hadn't necessarily expected, but it really provided administrative functions with a lot more relevance. They felt more relevant in the delivery of the organization because they could quantify their contribution. All right, so this is an interesting use case. It's actually a bit of an amalgam of multiple use cases, but we've framed it as being a single organization. It's a medium-sized nonprofit that relied heavily on donations in terms of getting its revenue, and it was re-examining its outreach to the donors because revenue was dropping, that the donations were slowing, and the perception was that the marketing campaigns that they had towards donors were losing their effectiveness. And so this prompted the organization to examine what it was doing and formulate different strategies to increase donations, which was their primary revenue stream. So the question they were asking is, who should the organization be focusing their outreach activities on, and what was the best method for that outreach? So up to this point of when they started doing this analysis, the organization had a set of standardized activities that they did in terms of outreach, and they applied them equally to pretty much all of their donors. There were some examples where there were one-on-one conversations that leadership had with some of their major donors, but a majority of donors were all treated the same way. So when they were doing an email campaign, everyone got the same email. When they were doing a telemarketing call campaign, everyone was getting the same sort of phone calls. There was no differentiation between one donor versus another, and no sort of stratification of the donors to treat them differently based upon, how much they donated, when they donated. So, overall, the organization didn't have a lot of insight into their donors, but they actually had a fair amount of data in their systems that they were able to leverage to support this initial data analytics, their donor analytics. So some of the stuff that they had, some of the data that they had, past donation amounts. So that allowed them to see at an individual level as well. So that allowed them to see if donations were trending up and down for individual donors and groupings of donors. It also allowed them to determine the total value of donations from the donor over the lifetime, lifetime giving, essentially. And then when that was combined with the number of instances of outreach, it actually allowed them to create and it's a wrong word, but I'm going to use it anyway, an efficiency ratio for each donor. What was the average donation per outreach, essentially? And it allowed them to categorize donors and understand who their most valuable donors were, something that I think they intuitively knew, but they didn't really have any empirical data to support it. So much like Hannah was talking about on the last slide about intuitively the institution understood that nursing was more expensive to deliver than English. This organization intuitively knew who their major donors were and the most valuable donors were, but they didn't have anything empirical to really show that and quantify it. They also had date of donation, so they knew when people had donated, and it allowed them to determine the periodicity of giving. So were donors only giving, in some seasonal way? Did they always give at the end of the year for some sort of tax reasons or, holiday donations? And, if that was the case, should they be only targeting those donors at the end of the year because that's when they knew that they were going to be responding to the outreach? It also enabled them to determine the recency of giving by looking at these date of donations and what I call donor aging. And the analysis found that, after 3 years of no giving, the response rate to outreach actually plummeted. So I call it the response rate glyph. It allowed the organization to target outreach to prevent donors from going over the response rate cliff and sort of keeping them current. When someone was reaching that 3 year of not having donated, then it became critical to outreach to make sure that they remained current. They also had some limited demographic information about age and location, which actually allowed a bit more targeted outreach, to make sure it was appropriate for the attended audience. But what the organization found after doing a fair amount of different analysis was that this 3-year response rate cliff was actually really important. And they found that, after 3 years, response to email campaigns were minimal. And after 3 years with no donation, the conversations that their call campaign had with the donors was actually very different from those who had actually donated more recently. And that's why in the chart on the right, you see this sort of vertical line, orange dotted line there for the response rate cliff that occurs at 3 years. The organization also did some analysis on the cost for each of the different campaigns. So what was the cost per donation for email campaigns versus, hard mail campaigns through USPS versus, calling campaigns, getting telemarketer to call. And that was you see a depiction of that on the horizontal line on the graph, the cost per donation. And this actually allowed the organization to determine who should you focus your campaign efforts on and how best to target potential donors. So if you had a donor who last gave over 3 years ago and the average donation was $10, there wasn't much point in doing a telemarketing campaign to this individual because the cost for the telemarketing campaign was, say, $25, and you're not going to recover those costs in the donation that you get for someone who's very unlikely to actually donate because they're past that response rate cliff. If someone was more recent than that, but still had a lower donation level, then perhaps you wouldn't want to focus on that donor for the telemarketing campaign, but you would in an email campaign, which is significantly cheaper. And so the donation, is actually going to be contributing to your ability to deliver services versus something that's just eating up the cost of the campaign. Similarly, for people who are donating above that cost amount, if you've got people who are in the top left-hand quadrant, you'd want to nurture those donors and possibly seek how you get higher donation amounts. And the ones that are on the right of that response rate cliff but are donating significant amounts, you want to start, making sure that you have some sort of campaign to keep them interested, or a comeback campaign. Come back and join us again. So it's things like that the original analytics helped this organization actually change the way it interacted with its donors and be more targeted in the way it did it, and therefore, by increasing those insights, gave them patterns and actually, in the long term, increased their revenues and sort of stopped the reductions that they were getting in those donations. Some other things that they said that they were going to start thinking about collecting were things like email open rates. The average for nonprofits on opening emails is about 25%. But having this information on who's opening and how often they're opening emails, allows you to see who's more engaged and potentially even start using that to understand, well, they opened the email, but they didn't donate. Perhaps we should target that user for volunteering and have them come, not give a donation in a monetary term, but give a donation from a time perspective. They also started thinking about really collecting and centralizing event attendance. So seeing which of their donors were attending events, indicating a higher level of engagement, and then used on very focused campaigns for just those users. And they also started better tracking volunteer engagement. So tracking who's volunteering, the hours that they're volunteering, and starting the plans were to start to try and make that equivalent to donors in terms of monetary sense, to give an understanding of how much volunteer engagement is actually contributing to the overall organization and how that compares to someone who's just giving money from a donor perspective. So it's a very interesting use case. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last use case that we're going to go through. It's really related to location planning. And it's around an organization that is actually in different geographic locations. So it's a fee-based nonprofit. So all of their revenues really come from the fees that their constituents are paying. Sorry, and it was they had lots of locations that have popped up over time because different people in different locations who were interested in the organization, whether as an employee or a volunteer, said, let's start a new outpost in this particular location. There wasn't a lot of strategy behind how their locations had been put in place. But they were unsure of the economic viability of these different locations, and they were worried that they were unduly subsidizing some locations at the expense of others. And so really the question that they were trying to answer was, how much does the organization subsidize each of its secondary locations, if at all, because they just didn't know. So, they had this belief that the secondary locations were all self-supporting. The reason they were there was just. So after this analysis, basically they found that only the main location, their primary location, was the one that was actually self-supporting. All of the others were being subsidized in some way, shape, or form. But just knowing margin wasn't enough for them. They wanted to be able to understand what's the contribution to mission for each of these different locations. So they actually developed a process that looked at a number of factors for each location. So the extent that other non-profit options were available within that location, how many customers were being served at each location, what was the size of the market in that location, and to the extent that they had them, what were the customer satisfaction ratings that they were receiving in each of these? So they took all of these different factors and normalized them and ranked them to arrive at an overall location score, which was basically a proxy for contribution to margin. Contribution to mission. And then they combined that information with margin and allow them to evaluate where each of the locations, were contributing to mission. And if they were, but not meeting margin, then perhaps it was worth, making sure that location remained. And they did this along with each location's story. There's a story that goes with each location, and that essentially formed that combination of quantitative and qualitative information really helped them understand which of those secondary locations they were going to keep in operation and which ones they were going to scale back or even terminate completely. Okay, polling question number 3. So how comfortable is your organization with data-driven decision-making? So are you very comfortable? You do it all the time. You're comfortable, you have the data, you do it occasionally, but you aren't quite there doing it all the time. C, you're somewhat comfortable, but you don't want to do it. You want to do it, but you don't actually have the data to support it, or you just don't know because you don't have the willpower or even the data to try it. So this is the third polling question. There'll be one more just before the end. But so how comfortable is your organization with data-driven decision-making? So I'll give you a few more seconds to respond. Just remember, you got to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Give you a couple more seconds. All right. Here we go. Okay, so a lot of you are very comfortable. You do it all the time, about 20% of you. A vast majority of you are comfortable. You have the data, you do it occasionally, but you're not quite there to doing it consistently. And, some of you are at the don't know. The results that we see here are pretty indicative of what we see when we talk to our clients as well. Most people have data, they're doing it, but it's really difficult to do it consistently. And it takes a lot of, support, leadership, etc. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through this very, very quickly. So, because no conversation would be about data-driven would be complete without talking about artificial intelligence. So I'm sure many of you have heard about artificial intelligence. It's come to the fore these days with ChatGPT. But it's not just limited to ChatGPT. Artificial intelligence is all about, basically building systems that are going to mimic human intelligence. So a system that can think for itself, it analyzes huge amounts of data and then starts to guide itself in terms of problem solving and learning. And as the data gets more complex and more of it, it learns more and more. Examples include robotics, chatbots, virtual assistants, autonomous cars, facial recognition in the health field. It's things like cancer detection, all sorts of things. So it's a very, very complex area. There's lots to learn in artificial intelligence, and it contributes a lot to what to what organizations can do in terms of data driven. Hina, do you want to go to the next slide? Just a quick slide to show you how it's going nuts. To put it bluntly, investment in AI is going through the roof. That investment is not just in ChatGPT, it's in all sorts of machine learning and all sorts of other areas. And if you look at the path to 1 million users, I mean, ChatGPT took 5 days to get 1 million users. Compare that to something like Netflix, which took 3.5 years, and Spotify, which took 2 months. So there's a huge adoption of artificial intelligence occurring. If you go to the next slide, I would just say if you're thinking about artificial intelligence and using it, I would do what we call an AI diagnostic. It doesn't matter whether you do it, whether you get someone else to do it. The concept is to basically go through a learning process, a rigorous learning process. What is AI? How's it going to work for your organization? How will it be perceived by your stakeholders? Where should you begin? What are those use cases? Have you got the technology? Have you got the data to support AI for those use cases? And then once you've decided on a few use cases, you've got to prototype them. Do you build it? Do you buy it? Do you get a partner to help you? How do you measure success? And then once you've got a good prototype, how do you scale it so that you can go beyond that? And what talent will you need? And what are the risks to you? And how do you control them? And then how do you continue evolving AI with other use cases? There's a process here, and using this process really helps the implementation of AI go much smoother than if you just try and jump into it, because you tend to have a lot of failures when you do it that way. All right, Hina, you're going to close on this slide.
Yep. So to summarize a lot of what we've touched on today, this slide covers a few key strategies, again, for data-driven success. The first being to be data ready. It's important to have the right data to start and actually support the analysis that you're after. So understanding what you need, how you're going to use it, how you're going to communicate it. From there, establishing repeatable processes using analytical tools for both consistency and efficiency. The one thing I'll mention here, and kind of the flip side of the coin, is to not let perfection get in the way of progressing. While it is important to have a well thought out plan, do remember that some data and some directional insight is better than none at all. And even if things are not perfect, moving in the right direction is what is important and what will allow you to continue to improve. Secondly, focus on culture. If there's a culture around data usage, then data automatically becomes the center of the conversation. Folks will turn to develop metrics that are available and understood by the masses, because they know that's how to get opinions heard and points across. And as Anthony had mentioned earlier, it's looked at as a fair way to have these conversations. Another big one that we...
Hey, Hina, sorry to interrupt. I think we're running out of time, and I think we need to get that last polling question in. So if I was to sum up this slide, and we'll give you the slides, but to sum it up, just do it. Don't let the enemy be the perfection of good. And there's loads of things you need to consider, but that's the first one. Just go ahead and start using it and using decisions. So final polling question. Would you like for a team member to reach out to you after today's webinar? Yes, maybe in the future, no. So if you fill that out, please. And that'll be the last polling question. I think, Hina, there's one more slide that you've got that's a good quote, I think, from memory. So we'll just give it a second to close the poll. You could just answer this final poll, that would be much appreciated. And remember, you need to answer at least 3 of the 4. All right, I think we've got that. That's done. All right, Hina, fire away.
Okay, so with that, we're going to leave you with one quote from William Edwards Deming, which is, "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion." So really, if you're going to take one thing away from this session today, let it be this, and the understanding that to garner any support for change, data and magic is key.
All right. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, reach out to Hina or myself at any time. Our emails, I think, are on the next slide, which you will also have available. Our next NFP webinar is going to be on October 23rd. It's a Wednesday, 1 p.m. Unlocking Synergies with Accounting Systems. Please join if you can. Thanks for listening to us. We value your feedback and ask that you take a short survey after this, which should appear when you leave the session. And then just as a reminder, recordings are going to be available in about a week. And just want to thank everyone for listening. And as I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Hina or myself at any time. We're happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.